Hello all, welcome to this session. In this session, I am going to answer one of the Java interview questions. That is, what are the different types of exceptions we have in Java? Let me answer. There are two types of exceptions we have in Java. One are checked exceptions and another one are unchecked exceptions. So what are checked exceptions and what are unchecked exceptions? Let me explain. Coming to the checked exceptions, the exceptions in the Java programs which are identified by the compiler the way before you run the programs. Okay, while you have written the code and before you run the program itself, the compiler, Java compiler is identifying that at this particular line of code, there is a possibility of you getting so and so exception like interrupted exception or IO exception. These are few examples that Java compiler will identify by compiling the code. During the compile time itself, the possibility of exceptions is identified by the compiler. Hence, they are called as checked exceptions. The exceptions that are checked by the compiler before you run the code are called as checked exceptions. Some examples of the checked exceptions are interrupted exceptions, and another one is a file not found exception, IO exception, and many other things are there. Okay. And coming to the unchecked exceptions, these exceptions are not identified by the compiler or not checked by the compiler. Hence, they are called as unchecked exceptions. Okay. When you write the code during the compile time, the compiler will not be able to check this kind of exceptions. Okay. The compiler will not be able to check this kind of exceptions. So few examples for such kind of unchecked exceptions, which compiler will not tell you during the compile time, saying that this particular line of code, there is a possibility of exception, like arithmetic exception, array index out of bounds exception, null pointer exception, input mismatch exception. Okay, like that, many kinds of many examples are there for unchecked exceptions which are not checked by the compiler during the compile time. Okay, the exceptions which are checked by the compiler and suggested by the compiler for you, that is a possibility, are called as checked exceptions. The exceptions which are not checked during the compile time by the compiler, and you will only encounter them when you run the program in the output if you get that kind of exceptions, but compiler has not checked it for you. Such kind of exceptions are called as unchecked exceptions. Let me practically demonstrate so that the answer for this question will become even more better and easy. Okay. So for that, I'll switch to the Eclipse IDE and create a new class, guys. I'll just name this class with some random name. Let's say class 16. I'll give you an example for checked exception, which will be checked by the compiler before you run the code. Another example for unchecked exception also. I'll just create this with main method. And inside this main method, I'm going to write some code like thread.sleep. Okay, this simple line in Java I'm going to write. I'll just give 3000 seconds and all, milliseconds, 3000 milliseconds. If you hover the mouse on this, you see during the compile time itself, the compiler is compiling this Java code and it's suggesting you that there is a possibility of exception known as interrupted exception. Okay, you have not run the code, but the compiler is checking that at this particular line, there is a possibility of exception. It is saying which type of exception is possible, interrupted exception is possible, it is saying the compiler. So such kind of exceptions which are suggested by the compiler by checking them during the compile time are called as checked exception. So interrupted exception will fall into which category? Checked exceptions category. Okay, because they are checked by the compiler before you run the code. In the compile time only, you will the compiler will suggest that there is a possibility of exception. And I'm going to give you another example of I'm going to give you an example for other type of exception type, that is unchecked exception. When you're trying to divide a number by 0 here, okay, system.out.println a, and if you run this program, system.out.println end of this program, etc. If I run this code, you see the compiler is nowhere saying that there is a possibility of an exception here at this particular line 9. But after you run the code, you will see that in the output, an exception detail will come. Okay, the program will stop or halt at this line because of an exception, because in Java, there is no possibility of dividing a number with 0. Okay, if you are trying to divide a number by 0, it's not possible in mathematics. In mathematics, we call it as infinite. And coming to the Java, if you try to divide a number by 0, we are going to get an arithmetic exception during the runtime. During the compile time, compiler will not check that this line may give you an exception in the output. It will not say anything. That's why this exception, arithmetic exception, that is not suggested by the compile time before running the code, that is during the compile time, if the compiler is not suggesting you, such exceptions will fall under unchecked exception because they are not checked by the compiler. But when I run the code, after I run the code in the output, at this line 9, I am going to get an exception known as arithmetic exception. You see at the Java line 9, I got an arithmetic exception here. We got this arithmetic exception. The reason for the exception is you are trying to divide a number by 0. That is the reason for the exception. So hope guys you got an idea what exactly are checked exceptions and what exactly are unchecked exceptions. If you get this question like what are the different types of exceptions we have in Java, you have to categorize them into checked exceptions and unchecked exceptions as the types, and you have to answer like that. Okay. So with practical demonstration, I've answered this question for you. So that's all for this session. Thank you. Bye bye.